he announces the mandates, essentially preventing millions of Canadians from boarding a plane or a train. And for civil servants who've been working from home since the pandemic began, they needed to be vaccinated. And it was just one of the most bizarre things.
So not only did the Trudeau cabinet generate an unnecessary travel lockdown, depriving Canadians of one of their most fundamental civil rights, especially in a country of our size, but they did it and scrambled to find a scientific lie to justify it. And it was so far off base from the science that they couldn't even find a suitable lie. And then they magnified their error by calling it election. And all of this was an instrumental attempt to gain more power on the election front, because Trudeau was worried about being in a minority position and looking for a way to increase his grip on the prime ministership.
Right.
Oh boy. It's no wonder no Canadian newspaper would publish that. That's hardly a story at all. Hi, everyone. I was sent an interesting article about a week ago, written by Rupa Subramanya. It was sent to me by two sources, one from Barry Weiss's Substack, which is where it was published, and also by Rex Murphy, who's one of Canada's foremost journalists. They were very impressed with it, the article, and thought it was important. And so I read it, and I think it is important. The article was called "Court Documents Reveal Canada's Travel Ban Had No Scientific Basis." Now, it was very interesting to me that Rupa had to publish this basically in an American news channel and sort of out of the way, although Barry Weiss's Substack is quite popular. And she's also had a lot of difficulty getting the story followed up in the Canadian legacy news. And it's a big story. And I put her in touch with the Telegraph in the UK, and they're going to publish, by all appearances, a variant of the story. And so it's pretty sad, bloody condition, let's say, that a big Canadian news story about the treacherous deceit of our government, federal government, is unable to attract any purchase in the legacy media outlets. It's stunning in some sense. In any case, what Rupa revealed was that the Trudeau government put in what were among the most stringent travel restrictions in the Western world as of August 13th, 2021, and claimed scientific justification for doing so. But in fact, not only was there no scientific justification whatsoever for doing so, there weren't any people who were making the decision who were qualified to determine whether such scientific evidence actually existed. And so despite the fact that everyone who objected was pilloried as a public menace, as well as however else they might be pilloried, it appears as though all of it was smoke and mirrors and sheer bloody instrumental politicking. And I heard the same thing about operations at the provincial government levels in Canada from very reliable sources, that all this so-called reliance on science was complete bloody nonsense, and that what was instead happening was that governments were conducting opinion polls like mad, which is not necessarily a bad thing in itself, but often is, and ruling on that basis, deriving policy on that basis, so on the basis of public fear and whim, and then passing that off as scientific. And that's pretty horrible. Or maybe it's really horrible. And that was Rupa's claim in some sense. So the story also covered a lawsuit brought against the government by a couple of plaintiffs who we have with us today, Karl and Shaun Rickard, who are represented by a lawyer, and that lawyer is Sam Presvelos, and he's here today too, so he's also going to talk. And then featured as well commentary by Bruce Pardy, and Bruce is a law professor at Queen's University who's been he's very interested in, well, let's call it rule of law by precedent, good old classic English common law, essentially. And so he's going to give a broader overview of the whole legal situation. So I'm going to start with some bios, and then Rupa is going to come in and tell the story and weave the plaintiffs and their representative lawyer into the story, and then Bruce is going to comment, and I'll chime in, probably too much. So first, Rupa Subramanya is a freelance columnist for the National Post, Canada, and Nikkei. Her previous work has also appeared in the Wall Street Journal and Foreign Policy. She resides in Ottawa, Ontario. Bruce Pardy is a law professor at Queen's University and is the executive director of Rights Probe. He's a critic of legal progressivism, social justice, and the expansive managerial state at the front lines of the culture war, which is raging madly inside the law. Dr. Pardy has taught at law schools in Canada, the US, and New Zealand. He's one of the co-creators of the Free North Declaration, a public petition and movement to protect civil liberties in Canada from COVID-19 irrationality and overreach. Sam Presvelos, the representing lawyer, founded Presvelos Law LLP at 25 years of age and serves there as managing partner. He specializes in corporate, commercial, and real estate litigation and has successfully represented clients before the Superior Court of Justice, Divisional Court, Court of Appeal, and Federal Court of Canada. His peers ranked Mr. Presvelos as one of the top 100 lawyers in Toronto in 2021 in Post magazine. Karl Harrison, one of the plaintiffs against the federal government, has opened, operated, and sold many successful restaurants, bars, and music and comedy venues. In 2011, he was named one of the top 20 most influential people in the UK hospitality trade. He has found success as a real estate investor and developer since 1987 and has been involved in the travel sector since the year 2000. He is a co-founder and co-owner of a well-known family holiday brand operating in the UK, France, Spain, and Ireland. It's a very interesting life. He was also co-founder and investor at Seattle Seawolves, a team which took the silverware in the first 2 seasons of Major League Rugby in the US. He's also been an occasional contributing writer for the UK satirical magazine Private Eye and has as well co-produced a series of award-winning short horror films. Last but not least, he has campaigned for reform of abusive practices in the UK pub sector. And finally, Shaun Rickard is a 55-year-old entrepreneur and small business owner who resides in Pickering, Ontario. He owns and operates a contracting business specializing in exterior aluminum and vinyl siding and eaves work on residential homes. He founded the company back in early 2013 and built it from the ground up. He's a British citizen and a permanent resident in Canada. Mr. Rickard came to Canada on a vacation to explore when he was just 20 years old and fell in love with the country. Mr. Rickard also had a fishing and outdoor TV show back in 2005 to 2007, which aired in Canada and the US on OLN, CTV, WFN, and Global. Welcome, Rupa, Bruce, Sam, Karl, and Shaun. Thank you very much for agreeing to talk with me today. Rupa, why don't you start filling us in? Tell us about the story and then fill in the story and bring these other characters in.
Okay. Well, thanks, Jordan. Thanks for having us all here. It really is a pleasure and a real honor. So I will quickly summarize the story for our viewers and our listeners. The Trudeau government always claimed that COVID-19 policies were based on the science and the evidence. They kept telling us we're consulting the experts, the scientists, and we're following the science and the evidence. But now, thanks to the civil suit brought by Karl Harrison and Shaun Rickard, and we've seen inside the guts of one of the key mandates of the federal government, implemented by the federal government, which is the vaccine mandate for travel, which proved so incredibly destructive and prevented millions of Canadians from traveling to even visit sick relatives and visiting their loved ones, to board a plane or a train. You couldn't even board a train for domestic travel purposes. And so while poring over hundreds of pages of testimony and cross-examination, thanks to the brilliant cross-examination by their attorney, Sam Presvelos, it becomes crystal clear that the mandates were going to happen, and that the bureaucrats had to scramble to find some kind of a scientific rationale for which they weren't able to do even just a few days before the mandate kicked in. So the question is, why did Trudeau do this? Trudeau was, if you remember, the Prime Minister was in a minority in the House of Commons. having lost his majority back in 2019 because of corruption and cronyism scams. And he was desperate to regain it, and vaccine mandates proved to be the perfect wedge issue. And that's what everybody was saying at that time. This is the fall of 2021. Why for travel? Well, one crucial reason is that it's the only sector apart from the federal workplace which comes under the federal government's powers. In other words, this was the only place where Trudeau could flex his muscles and impose a vaccine mandate, and that's what he did.
So your claim here, if I have it right, just so everyone listening knows, is that Trudeau, who was struggling to maintain popularity, to maintain his government, picked a divisive wedge issue because it was a divisive wedge issue, imposed it on Canadians, and then attempt to insist that it was justified by the science.
There was no. It's very clear. The scientific rationale is lacking, at least based on the cross-examination of the key government witnesses in this case.
So he risked splitting the country apart and pitting people against each other personally and socially to facilitate his government's grip on power.
That's what it appears to be at this point, yeah.
Okay, so sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to clarify that. So, all right, so you started investigating this. Why?
Well, I was actually aware of the case, but I really had no entree into it until, through a mutual acquaintance, one of the applicants reached out to me, and then I became aware of the case and the background and their fight against the federal government, against the travel mandate. And then, thanks to their litigation, the documents eventually became publicly available, and through the federal court. Ironically, I must point this out, that in response to my piece telling the story of Shaun and Karl's legal battle, the federal court, in a very unusual move, and this is what I'm told by many people, that it was an extremely unusual move, they actually made it easier for the public to access the documents by tweeting about it, and they made a link publicly available. And I have to say that some of the cross-examination really reads like a John Grisham novel. You know, you've got the secretive government panel within Transport Canada, which is tasked with crafting the mandate. Apart from its head, who's a career bureaucrat, she has a degree in English literature. We don't really know much about the others. There are about 20 people on this panel, and she names one individual on this panel, but who seems to have some kind of a public health background. When I reached out to her, she said she has a master's in science, but she refused to tell me what that was in. For all you know, it could be astrophysics, but we don't know that. But the key point here is none of these people had a background in medicine, epidemiology, infectious diseases, virology, you name it. They were just there to provide a cover for the mandate.
And you talk about Jennifer, is it Jennifer Little?
It's Jennifer Little, yes. And
she was the one who was in charge of this, is that correct?
Yeah, she was the Director General of this group of COVID
and these are all civil servants you're talking about?
They're all civil servants.
Okay, why did they regard it as part of their duty to provide a cover story for the politicking of the Liberal government? I thought they had a duty to the public fundamentally. So why were they roped into this, and why did they agree to it?
Well, I mean, this is something that you would have to ask them, but my guess is, they were just doing their jobs, I guess. You have the secretive task force within Transport Canada, and they really had no good scientific rationale, and they were looking for one. They were scrambling for one days before, literally less than 10 days before the mandate goes into effect. And including hoping that the Public Health Agency of Canada, PHAC, would come up with something, which they didn't. And Jennifer Little, the bureaucrat that I referred to with the bachelor's degree in English literature, repeatedly said the decisions were made at very high levels. And these were people senior to her, and invoked cabinet confidence and refused to answer who exactly ordered the mandates.
This was during cross-examination.
Yes, this was during cross-examination.
And she has the right to keep that information secret if it's come from what? From a high enough legislative source?
I would guess so. I mean, this is not my area of expertise. I don't really know the law governing civil servants, but she certainly repeatedly invoked cabinet confidence, and when she was asked questions on who exactly ordered the mandates, making it pretty clear. I guess, I mean, one could infer from this the decision was taken either by the Prime Minister himself or the cabinet as a whole. This confirms what many had suspected all along, that when the Prime Minister introduced the federal mandate, both for travel and for the civil service, and called a snap election 2 days later, August 13, he announces the mandates, essentially preventing millions of Canadians from boarding a plane or a train. And for civil servants who've been working from home since the pandemic began, they needed to be vaccinated. And it was just one of the most bizarre things.
Okay, so let me stop you there and summarize. So, because this is where the plot gets particularly thick. So not only did the Trudeau cabinet generate an unnecessary travel lockdown, depriving Canadians of one of their most fundamental civil rights, especially in a country of our size, but they did it and scrambled to find a scientific lie to justify it, and it was so far off base from the science that they couldn't even find a suitable lie, and then they magnified their error by calling it election, and all of this was an instrumental attempt to gain more power on the election front, because Trudeau was worried about being in a minority position and looking for a way to increase his grip on the prime ministership.
Right.
Oh boy. It's no wonder no Canadian newspaper would publish that. That's hardly a story at all.
And Jordan, you know, if I may say this, you know, if this really had been about saving lives, why didn't Trudeau just impose the mandates and campaign on them as a fait accompli? That would have been the right thing to do. Instead, he cleverly used these mandates as a wedge issue, and unfortunately for him, he managed to just eke out another minority government. But in the process, he ended up dividing the country. He ended up demonizing and marginalizing millions of Canadians who were unable or unwilling, for a range of different reasons, to get the vaccine.
Yeah, well, and a huge part of the reason they were unable or unwilling to get the vaccine was because they didn't trust the Trudeau government at all. And so there were all sorts of people, and some of them, I suppose, were conspiratorial in their inferences, but many weren't, who thought there's something fishy going on here. I don't trust this a bit. And those were all the people who were demonized as, you know, radical anti-vaxxers.
We'll get back to more with Dr. Jordan Peterson in just a second. First, we'd like to tell you about Birch Gold. The Consumer Price Index has reached yet another 40-year high, and the latest GDP numbers confirm that the United States is in a recession. Now is not the time to have all your money in the stock market or tied to the US dollar. Take action to protect your savings from a highly turbulent economy now by diversifying at least some of your investment portfolio into gold and silver from Birch Gold Group. Text Jordan to 989898 and Birch Gold will send you a free information kit on how to transition an IRA or eligible 401k into an IRA in precious metals. Birch Gold will even help you hold gold in a tax-sheltered account. For decades, investors have relied on gold and silver as a hedge against inflation. Now you can too. With an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau, countless 5-star reviews, and thousands of satisfied customers, secure your future with gold from Birch Gold now. Text Jordan to 989898 and get real help from Birch Gold today. Again, text Jordan to 989898 to claim your free, no-obligation information kit on how to protect your hard-earned savings with gold.
We're going to turn to Karl Harrison, who's taken and Shaun Rickard, who've taken a lawsuit out against the Canadian government for reasons related to the story that Rupa has been telling. And so, Karl, perhaps you can start by filling us in on what you're doing and why.
Yeah, thanks. We're taking. We've made an application for a judicial declaration, essentially in the federal court, in relation to the Canadian government's discriminatory mandates for requiring a vaccine as a precursor to traveling. And we filed that in December after a lot of thought and consideration over previous months separately. I came to this differently to Shaun. I came to this throughout the summer months of 2021. In April of 2021, I was listening to the Prime Minister of Canada saying that there would be a vaccine for any Canadian that wanted one. And by the time we got to the fall, I had watching a man on television as the Prime Minister of Canada talking about 5 to 7 million of his fellow Canadians as people who were racists and misogynists and people who were taking up space, people who might not be tolerated, which is language. I mean, I'm coming up 60 years old. I've not really heard that kind of language from a Prime Minister of many Western democracies until recently. And I certainly wouldn't have expected it from a Canadian Prime Minister, but there we go. And so during the summer of 2021, the Prime Minister decided he was going to dissolve Parliament, go for an election and try to get re-elected in the fall. And clearly he had, as you said earlier, identified with his advisors, whoever they are, a wedge issue, which based around people's health choices. And he thought he could polarize the population, and he thought he could use it to his advantage.
Why did you feel so strongly about this to take such dramatic action? Because obviously most Canadians, even within that 5 to 7 million number that you described, grumbled about this but didn't do what you did. Why did you identify this as so important, and why were you willing to put yourself at substantial risk financially and in terms of your time to do something about it?
It's not a difficult question to answer. I mean, there are three. When you see this kind of policy implemented by governments, there are three things you can primarily do. I mean, you can accept it, you can fight it, or you can run away. And it's a blend of those actions. And I think if you're able to fight these things, if there's something you can do, then you should. It's good citizenship. I mean, I'm a recent immigrant to Canada. I'm a Canadian citizen and a UK citizen, and I brought my family here in 2009. And I fell in love with Canada in the 1990s. And as a recent immigrant from Europe, I feel it's a part of citizenship to stand up against these kind of issues. So running away wasn't an option for us. Accepting it wasn't an option. So how can we fight it? We're not in politics. The opposition parties throughout the summer of 2021 were weak. I mean, Erin O'Toole, I think, just demonstrated an extraordinary lack of vision and weakness throughout the summer of 2021 by seemingly going along with Trudeau rather than actually opposing him. Whilst he was opposing him, his polling was doing well. And as soon as he started to go along with him, he plummeted and subsequently lost. So I thought, what can I do? I started to think about a legal action. And at that point, came across Shaun, who was, I saw him on Twitter, the sort of global town hall. And I saw Shaun there with, saying some of the same things that I was thinking and starting the process of raising money. And I reached out to Shaun. I thought I could contribute from my own legal experience in the past. I thought that was something I could usefully add, and I thought I could usefully add funding. I've been in business a long time, so I have some resource, and I thought that's something else I can do. So I couldn't politically oppose at that point. We could protest. We can go and do direct action, and we can protest with other people, and Canadians should always protest where things are wrong. And coming from the UK, we're used to protest. I mean, it's, as you know, I mean, you've been there a lot, I think, to the UK, Jordan, and protest in the UK is seen as, something that definitely has to be done. So taking part in that, something we can do, and legal action, something we can do. I came together with Shaun in the fall 2021, and I'll let Shaun pick up there because he can explain how we came to work with Sam. I think it's probably helpful.
Sure. Shaun, over to you.
Yeah, hi, and thank you again for having us all on and helping us get this story out. As you said, the Canadian legacy media have essentially ignored this story completely, which is mind-boggling and also deeply disturbing. But I guess this whole process kind of came about for me, as Karl said, in September when I heard this sort of disgusting, divisive rhetoric coming out of our Prime Minister's mouth when he was campaigning. And the further we went along, and the more this whole threat of banning the dirty unvaccinated or those who refuse to be injected from getting on a plane or a train and even leaving the country just absolutely terrified me. I mean, to me, he resembled a sort of a narcissistic, sociopathic tyrant, and it really troubled me. And I felt that I had to do something about it. I like to travel. I feel it's my right to travel. I'm a free man. And for somebody to come along and take that away with no recourse was deeply disturbing to me. So I immediately started putting the feelers out there to various people. I spoke to a couple of politicians. Most of them were useless. And eventually I spoke with somebody, and I was given Sam's name. And literally in the same night, I had a conversation with one person who introduced me to Sam. Sam and I spoke, and that same night I started a GoFundMe campaign on a fundraising campaign on GoFundMe, and started tweeting about it. I'd never used Twitter before. I had 4 followers, and in 6 weeks I went to 7,800 followers. And during that process, we were gaining a lot of traction and a lot of people's interest, and I began to realize just how this had affected, like Karl said, 6 to 7 million people's lives. People unable to go and visit family, that type of thing. And this is before it even happened. So I got the ball rolling. I spoke with Sam. We hit it off immediately. And he was as passionate about this as I was. And we came up with a sort of a vague strategy of how we might do this. And then the first thing was to start raising some money. And through that process on Twitter, I started getting messages from people like you do. As your followers grow, people start sending you messages, some helpful, some not, some supportive, some not. And I got a couple of messages from Karl, and I was kind of fielding through all these messages and so on. And eventually, he sent me something that sort of resonated with me, and I found out he was in British Columbia, and so I messaged him back. A couple of times we spoke to each other, through direct message, and then we eventually arranged to have a Zoom call with Sam. And that's the first time that all 3 of us spoke as a group. And Karl very kindly at that time, again, as passionate as we all were about putting a stop to this tyranny. And I don't use that word lightly, but that's exactly the way we perceived it.
Why did you two have enough confidence to go ahead with this? Now, I mean, at that point, people who were opposing the vaccine say, so I'd like to know why it bothered you so much, what the vaccine mandate meant to you personally, but then why you were able to presume that you knew well enough better to risk bringing a lawsuit against the Canadian government. Did you have support from your family? I mean,
No.
Obviously, no, you didn't have support from your family,
No,
but you had support from each other. Who supported you? Why did you have enough confidence to do this?
It's a very good question. And I, to be honest, to this day, I don't know why I did this. I was just very angry, and I felt somebody needed to do something. The politicians weren't even speaking up, as Karl pointed out. Aaron O'Toole, I mean, what a wet blanket he ended up being. Just a complete rollover. They saw these atrocities, and I'll call them that, going on, and nobody spoke up. Nobody said a thing. So I felt that, I don't know why, I just felt I felt compelled to do something.
How helpful was it? How helpful was it to have Shaun to talk to about it? I mean, now there's 2 of you and not 1, and so that's twice as many people.
It made a huge difference. I mean, we've been a support group for one another since day one. We've all made, and just to clarify, we've all made huge sacrifices. We've all lost friends throughout this process. Certain family members begin to think you're a bit crazy. But we've always had each other, and we were so in line, and it was like it was meant to be. I said this the other day in Rupa's show.
You just said something very terrible there, as far as I'm concerned, that you lost friends and you were subject to the disruption of your familial cohesion. And so one of the things Rupa pointed to in the beginning part of this conversation was the fact that Trudeau found a divisive wedge issue and exploited it for his own purposes. And so what does that mean? We want to make that concrete because that's just abstract. Yeah, well, it means that your friends turn your back on you or vice versa, and that now you're at the throats of your family members. And that's how civil society decays. And so the story here, and this is why it's so absolutely appalling that the Canadian legacy media won't pick it up, is that Trudeau was willing to sow that kind of personal level discord, to say nothing of the utter economic and financial catastrophe that the policies produced, to do nothing but not even really manage to cement his grip on power.
I think that it's quite possible that Trudeau and the government, in doing what they've done, have very badly misread the numbers, if nothing else. I think they maybe thought that people fell into one of two camps. Either they would be people that would be pro-mandates or people that would be against them. And I think it's much more nuanced than that. And certainly in my experience of doing this exercise has been that whilst, I've lost a couple of friends, but I've got a lot of family support for doing this and a lot of support from people locally and some surprising people. And I think there's an element of a lot of folks who disagree with it sort of going along with it, keeping their head down. That's sort of an element of Canadian politeness almost. And I think that's a challenge going forward for Canada. As Canada perhaps, maybe Trudeau's done us all a favor by pushing Canada towards the end of what some might see as a political adolescence.
Well, I was thinking when Trudeau called the truckers misogynists and bigots and said that they were fomenting a rebellion in Ottawa, let's say financed by MAGA Republicans of all the preposterous things, I thought, because I was down in the States when that was happening, talking to Americans, telling them that this was the story, and they were like open-jawed in amazement, including the Democrats, that anyone would ever possibly believe that. And then I thought, well, you better give the devil his due. Why would Canadians be willing to fall for that, let's say? And then I thought, well, here's the story, man. It's like, for 150 odd years, we've really been able to evince a reasonable trust in our political institutions. All three political parties, from right to left, governed with some degree of credibility and decency and predictability. And then the legacy media did their job being responsible critics. And I say you could even say that of the CBC for many years. And the education system was reliable and the legal system wasn't taken over by DEI warriors and so forth. And now all that's, or a lot of that, has changed. And so now Canadians were being asked by their Prime Minister to accept one of two stories. Either the truckers, for example, were misogynists and bigots hell-bent on destabilizing Canadian democracy, or you could no longer trust the government in a fundamental sense, or the legacy media, and God only knows how much of the education system and the courts. And so, in some sense, for a sensible and conservative people, the logical choice there was to, assume the lesser devil and think that the truckers and the anti-vaxxers, so-called, and so forth, were, a fringe misogynist and bigot group, and that everything in the background was really running as it should be. But as Rupa's story indicates, and as I said, I heard exactly the same story several months ago from high-level consultants to provincial governments across Canada, that they were doing the same thing, ruling by poll, post hoc justifying it by science. All right, so Sam, you got involved in this, so tell us your story and flesh out what's been happening on the legal front and where this is going to go. And I want to return to Karl, too, about the funding issue after that.
Sure. So good afternoon, and thanks as well for having me on the podcast. This is very much Terra Nova for me. I'm not a constitutional lawyer. I never saw myself getting involved in a constitutional case of this magnitude. And I think I've said before elsewhere that constitutional law was my lowest mark ever in school. And yet here I am at the forefront of this challenge. I think like my clients, like Karl and like Shaun, I also felt compelled to do something. If you see there's a problematic trend happening, and you have a means to affect some sort of a change, and you do nothing about it, I think in your own way you're contributing to the problem. And everyone has a different threshold of getting involved. And quite frankly, my threshold, I sort of crossed that threshold at the mandatory hotel quarantine, which is a policy that I never would have imagined ever witnessing in a Western democracy. The idea that somebody would have to quarantine pending a result of a virus that, quite frankly, we've seen in some iteration before was frankly disturbing to me. And that's really what propelled me. And I was very fortunate to get connected with Shaun and then again with Karl. And it's true, Shaun, Karl, and I in many ways have become our own little family. And we've been very fortunate to be supportive of one another in what has been an extremely grueling 7-8 months. This case really started Christmas Eve. I suppose you made it a present to the government, and we're still in the midst of it. And here we are in August, and just today I'm submitting my final materials to the court for the application. So it's been an extraordinary process, and we've learned, as you've come to learn, very extraordinary things along the way.
Well, can you no one listening knows how a case like this proceeds. So could you walk us through the basis for the case, the nature of your challenge, how the government lawyers are resisting this, and lay out the story of the court battle and where it's headed?
Sure. So fundamentally, there's sort of two ways in which litigation proceeds through the court system. The one way is an action, and an action is sort of what most people come to know in like TV courtroom dramas, where you have a judge and you have a witness, and there's this idea that people are yelling and cross-examining, and they're getting evidence orally, which is what we call viva voce evidence. That's not what's happening here. This is proceeding by way of an application. And an application is largely a paper-based record. So what happens is people put in evidence to the court, and they do that by way of an affidavit. And you can think of an affidavit as a story. And you get stories from the applicants like Shaun and Karl about how the mandates have infringed their charter rights. And you also get, stories, I'll just call them a little bit more informally, from experts who talk about the science and different policy considerations. And then each side has to do that. So both sides have to produce their evidentiary record, which is, as I mentioned, exclusively done by paper. And then what happens is we participate in what is called the cross-examination. In an action, the cross-examination is done live in front of a judge, and the judge is there to assess the credibility of the witnesses and weigh testimony. In an application, which is what we're doing, that is done with privately in a boardroom with a court reporter, and there's endless hours of cross-examinations based on what people have said in their affidavits, their story. And so a lot of the evidence that Rupa is referring to came out in the process of that cross-examination, because as you know, our system, our justice system, is premised on the adversarial context and the idea that if competing evidence is tested, the truth lies somewhere and the truth will come out. And we spent May and June, literally 2 months, just exclusively in cross-examination. We then take the affidavit records and we take the cross-examination transcripts. We file that with the court, and then we appear at a hearing. And in that hearing, we make reference to the evidence both in the affidavits, in the expert reports, and also in the cross-examination transcripts. And it's just submissions from lawyers in front of a judge.
Okay, so what's the nature of the challenge? The government put in these mandates, and they were mandated and required, and you're objecting to that. What exactly is the objection, and why are you even vaguely allowed to do this, let's say?
Well, I should hope we're allowed to do this, or else we have a much larger constitutional crisis than I currently think we do. But, first and foremost, there is a prima facie infringement of Shaun, Karl, and those Canadians who are not vaccinated, a prima facie infringement of their Section 6 charter right, which is the right of mobility. And I think it's one of the most fundamental rights that we have in the charter. It goes to the very essence of what it means to live a dignified existence, the notion that, a man or woman can get up and move about their country and leave their country at their will. And that's been directly engaged in this charter challenge. And in a context, quite frankly, that I've never seen before. A lot of the Section 6 cases deal with issues like extradition, deportation. I've never seen a case like this, that a government policy in reference to a public health mandate has had the effect of preventing their own citizens from moving between provinces or from leaving their country. In fact, I can tell you right now, I have not found a case like this other than a case in Newfoundland in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the second thing, which I think is also very novel here, is the government has effectively created Sophie's choice, right? They're asking Canadians to do a little bit of horse trading with their charter rights. You cannot simultaneously exercise your right to travel while also exercising your Section 7 right to protect your bodily autonomy. What do I mean by that? You need to make a decision. You are either going to get on a plane and get vaccinated, or you are not going to get vaccinated and you're going to forfeit your right to use federally regulated transportation system. I think that's actually constitutionally unprecedented. I've never seen a scenario where a government policy has created such a direct conflict, such that it coerces you to choose one over the other. And let's be clear about that. Shaun and Karl were coerced into not traveling because they wanted to protect their decision-making over what is an inherently private choice, i.e. vaccination. And so both of those issues are very much engaged, and it's on this basis that we've brought this application.
Okay, and so what's the fine, I got it. So what's the government counterclaim? Now, hypothetically, the emergency was such that the science indicated that the government could suspend Canadian charter rights. Okay, what kind of evidence do you need? When can you suspend rights? And when you suspend rights, by what principles are you allowed to suspend them?
Well, we were on a quest to answer a lot of those questions. As you know, obviously, no right is absolute. And if the government has a compelling objective such that they may need to infringe a charter right, they're entitled to do so if they come to the table with the right type of evidence, right? There's a reverse onus. I mean, once my clients show that their rights have been breached, the government then has to go to court and convince the court that they were justified in doing so. And that's where this fight is really happening. What is the justification? What is so compelling about the risk of the unvaccinated flying that you believe it is permissible in our democratic society to force unvaccinated people into making the decision that I just described? And I can tell you that having been living this case for the last 7 months, the approach the government has seemed to take is the casual application of general scientific principles to the transportation sector. They reason that because vaccination is generally good and desirable, everybody should do it. And because it provides some sort of a transient benefit, you should do it. It's generally desirable. It's good for public health policies. And we're going to use means available to us to encourage and incentivize that behavior.
Well, there's a difference between should and must, let's say, not least. And then, of course, we have the problem Rupa pointed out, which was the scientific evidence for the utility of the travel ban itself was apparently entirely lacking. So at the moment, and I don't know how this is playing out in court, but in the context of this conversation and other conversations I've had that are similar, the evidence, legal and scientific on the government, and let's also say moral, shall we, on the government side, seems pretty, well, how about we call it appallingly and unprecedentedly weak?
Well, it's interesting that you use the word morality there, because I actually, in cross-examinations, I did ask the individual who was responsible for the development of the policy whether there was an ethical consideration behind the vaccine mandate. And the answer is that there is not, which is astounding because there's actually an ethical frame. No, it gets better. There's actually an ethical framework available by the government online that is supposedly used to guide ethical decision-making in the context of the pandemic. So
that wasn't used either.
No.
So if we tried to give the devil his due, and so I'll speak as a critic of Rupa here, her claim fundamentally is that this was nothing but blatant, cynical, narcissistic politicking of the lowest order. And we might say, well, no, that's probably an oversimplification. There must have been some other justification generated, like in good faith, and then also post hoc as at least as a cover-up. But essentially, in some sense, what you seem to be saying is that you've uncovered very little evidence of any of that in the cross-examinations. So even as a scam, it wasn't a very good one.
There is evidence that, vaccines can help protect against developing severe outcomes and death. The question is, how compelling is that evidence? How long does that protection actually last? But the bigger question is, why does that matter in the context of the transportation system?
Exactly.
When you're talking about the fact that travel contributes 1% or less by the government's own data to COVID-19 transmission, and somehow this is the targeted industry that we're going to focus on and impose a vaccination requirement as a precondition for travel, why isn't anyone comparing that to the general epidemiological situation in the community? And here's a surprise for you. Nobody did that. Nobody looked to compare what's the positivity like in different settings in the general community. Because if you're not traveling, where are you? You're at home. You're in the supermarket. You're watching soccer. You're watching a basketball game, all of which, by the way, you can do without being vaccinated, but you can't travel, which is also one of the safest places to be. I mean, we have an expert, who has testified that and this is public knowledge. I mean, the filtration system in modern aircrafts are better than the filtration systems in operating rooms.
We'll get back to more with Dr. Peterson in just a second. First, founded by Dr. Leonard Garante, a renowned MIT researcher and 30-year student of the science of aging, Elysium Health is on a mission to translate critical scientific advancements in aging research into accessible health products and technologies. Matter, Elysium's brain aging supplement, was developed in partnership with the University of Oxford. Matter does what no other product does. It slows the shrinking of our brains. For most of us, brain shrinkage begins in our early 30s and impacts memory, learning, and even physical activity. Lifestyle factors such as alcohol consumption, smoking, and poor sleep habits accelerate this process. Matter is patented and clinically proven to slow the age-related loss in the brain's memory centers by an average of 86%. Many Matter customers have reported improvements in memory and cognition. Go to explorematter.com/Jordan and enter code JBP10 at checkout to save 10% off Matter prepaid subscriptions as well as other Elysium Health supplements.
Okay, so you just dropped two bombshells there, eh? Not that there haven't been any others dropped during this conversation, but two. I'm going to highlight them. The first is that by the government's own admission, travel was a vector for the transmission of less than 1% of the virus. So now we're talking at best about a 1% probability of contracting a disease that has something approximating a 2% mortality rate, if that. And that's particularly true only for people who are extremely ill or extremely elderly, who have other compromising health conditions. So it's a negligible risk of a negligible risk, but that justifies charter right suspension. And then you said something equally appalling, which was that anyone with any sense would have rank ordered transmission risks, right, across all the possible, let's say across the range of 95% of the social interactions and activities that Canadians engage in. We would have rank ordered that in terms of danger. One of the things we would have found out, by the way, is that locking people up together was probably a dangerous thing to do rather than a good thing to do. But in any case, that's what you do at the policy level, right? Here's the dangers, rank ordered. Let's knock them off from the top down. But you said none of that happened either. There was no methodology for doing a comparative analysis. And that's reminiscent to me of the fact that we locked down everybody at home and we blew apart the supply chain. We never did any analysis whatsoever to find out if the economic consequences of that were going to be more devastating physically, psychologically, and in the long term than the epidemic itself. And they're going to end up being far more devastating than the epidemic, I think, by all evidence generated to date. So Bruce, maybe we'll turn over to you for a bit to get a bit of an overview, and then I'm going to go back to talk about the funding situation. Then we'll go back to Rupa. Bruce, two questions come to mind for me right away. The first is, if the government, let's say it more clearly, if the mandarins in the Trudeau cabinet violated the charter for the purposes of their instrumental politicking, how serious is that offense in legal terms, and what is the recourse?
Right. Well, let's back up just a step. Before you get to the charter even, there's a principle in governance, which is this. Governments can't just create any policies that they like. There's a difference between the government and the legislature. And anything a government does in terms of making rules, it has to have authorization to do in a statute that the legislature has passed. And in this case, in the case of the airline mandate, we're talking about the Aeronautics Act. Now, the Aeronautics Act gives to Cabinet and the Minister of Transportation the power to make all kinds of rules about all kinds of things that deal with flight, with the airline industry. But that's not an open-ended discretion. The fact of the matter is that governments make policies that are politically motivated all the time. And they're allowed to do that as long as they can fit them within the authority that they have in a statute. But the problem for the government in this respect is this, that the rationale that they've given, if they've given one at all, does not fit within the authority that the Aeronautic Act gives. So in other words, the minister is allowed to create interim orders that have to do with the safety of the airline industry, of the passengers, of the crew, and so on. And the premise of a vaccine mandate is that if you have the vaccine, then you won't get infected. And if you don't have the vaccine, then you will get infected. But in the case of this vaccine, that has really never been the case. It was pretended to be early on, but that has never been really the official claim, at least from the manufacturers of this vaccine. So if you don't have that excuse, if the vaccine will not prevent infection, then what else do you have?
So is there, okay, so there's two issues here then, I think, that you just delineated. One is that, correct me if I'm wrong, that it isn't obvious that the Trudeau cabinet had the proper governmental authority to impose this mandate because it exceeded the purview of what would be generally acceptable practice on the legislative front. So it was an overreach of power, independent of the fact that it violated the charter. Have I got that right?
Just put aside the charter first. Sure, you just on the basis of pure authority and the way government works. We have separation of powers. Yes, governments and legislatures. Now, I know to most people, those two things will look like the same thing because the same people are heading both of these branches. You know, the Prime Minister sits in the House of Commons and the cabinet does as well. And they seem to run the show in the legislature, but they're two different things. And the legislature must pass a statute that gives the authority to the executive branch, which is what the cabinet heads, to make certain rules. Now, that authority is limited according to its terms. And those terms in this case are, you can make rules about safety. But the problem is that if you don't have the prevention of infection as one of the characteristics of the vaccine, then the next question is, well, okay, but then what's the safety thing you're doing?
Well, Rupa and the plaintiffs and their representing lawyer have already made the claim that the evidence on the safety front not only wasn't there to begin with, but couldn't even be scrounged up post hoc. So that just seems absurd on the face of it.
Well, right.
Okay.
Right. So if I may, what Rupa's article was about, and what Sam's cross-examination managed to achieve, was essentially an admission that there wasn't really any solid scientific recommendation from the health and science people to the transport people that this ought to be done. I think the cross-examination was very well done, and it might be interesting just to read you a very short sentence from Jennifer Little that Rupa was talking about in her cross-examination. All right. So the question was, are there any emails, any briefs, any reports from Health Canada or Public Health recommending the implementation of a mandatory vaccination policy for travel? And after a long pause, the answer was this: I do not recall a document from the Public Health Agency or Health Canada to Transport Canada recommending that Transport Canada take this approach.
Wow.
In other words, there was no solid written recommendation to do this. And
right.
And
that sounds clear enough so that it's not even a matter of opinion. Right, because you can always bandy about the objection that's opinion. Rupa, you have a comment.
Yeah, just to quickly jump in here, Jordan, just picking up from what Bruce was saying, that, the damning email exchange that I mentioned in my story, it's about a senior Transport Canada official who is emailing his counterpart at PHAC and asking this individual, look, the mandate's going to be going into effect in a few days. We need some scientific rationale, some scientific evidence as soon as possible. He doesn't hear from this individual for a few days. Now it's like literally the clock is ticking, and he presses her and he says, we need something fairly quick. So please, could you get something to us soon? And she eventually responds to him. And it's just generic homilies about how vaccines are good for you. You should get vaccinated. And we believe that vaccines prevent severe disease and so on and so forth. The question is, what does this have to do with the transportation sector? How is it preventing transmission? How is it specific to the travel sector? That's the question. And I will also tell you one more thing that I couldn't get into my story. Again, this goes back to Jennifer Little. She's asked about the implementation of the mandate, and she says, look, had we implemented this mandate when 50% of eligible Canadians had been vaccinated, it would have created, to use her own words, chaos in the system. If this were really about public health policy, shouldn't vaccination have been that should have been the primary consideration? But what they do is they wait till 80% of Canadians have been vaccinated, where a high percentage of Canadians are vaccinated, to implement a vaccine mandate, which is just extraordinary.
So, and I agree. Just to finish off this thought, to go back to this idea that the rationale, let's just give them the benefit of the doubt. Let's say that the actual health-based scientific rationale is, as Rupa alludes to, that vaccines are generally a good thing, and that having a vaccine mandate will incentivize people to get a vaccine when they wouldn't otherwise do so. That is, it's not about being on the plane. It's about the fact that people who want to be on a plane will have to get vaxxed. Okay, here's the problem. If that's the rationale, that is not about the safety of air travel. And that means that is not an order authorized under the Act.
So that's the legal issue. Well, the moral issue might be, well, if you have to use compulsion, then maybe that's a sign that your policy is ill-formulated. And also, I would say, from an epidemiological perspective, or in a psychological perspective, in order for that argument to be credible, you'd have to have documentation showing that if you added compulsion to the vaccination process, that would actually produce less resistance to the vaccine rather than more. And that evidence would be very hard to come by, because there's a certain number of people that as soon as you force them to do anything, even if it's in their own good, for their own good, even if that's documented, the mere fact that you're forcing them is going to convince them to tell you to go to hell. And I'm, for one, very happy that there is a minority of people like that. So that the evidence that I don't think there's any good evidence for the use of compulsion in public health, or at least there's no evidence suggesting that policy based on compulsion shouldn't be regarded as inferior to policy based on rational dialogue and let's say positive motivation and consensus, which is a much better grounds for, what would you say, the consent of the governed. How about that? So can we turn, Bruce, to the charter issue then? Have you elaborated out on the first one enough?
Well, yeah, sure. So as Sam alluded to, this weighing up of rationales will take place under a Section 1 analysis. And you'll get to Section 1 only after the breach of the charter right, in this case, Section 6, has been established. And so I would say in this case, I mean, this cross-examination is terrific for the purpose of that Section 1 analysis.
Okay, tell us what a Section 1 analysis means.
Right. So Section 1 analysis basically says, Section 1 says, all of the rights and freedoms in the charter are subject to reasonable limits. If the government can demonstrate that the infringement of the right is justified in a free and democratic society, then we're going to say, okay. And in order to show that it's justified, the government has to show that the problem that they were trying to solve was serious enough that it justified these measures, that they chose a proportional way of doing so, that it caused an infringement as little as possible under the circumstances, and so on. So, to Sam's point that charter rights and freedoms are not absolute, and of course they're not, Section 1 over time has shown to be a pretty large gate, wide enough for the government to drive a truck through sometimes.
Yeah, truck, yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Well, Brian Peckford, a former premier of Canada and one of the founders of the charter, has vociferously objected to the government's use of Section 1, saying that he knows perfectly well, as a consequence of discussing the issue with the people who designed the charter to begin with back in the 1980s, that none of them intended that Section 1 be used in a circumstance as trivial and uncertain as this one.
Right. But so to give the courts in this particular moment the benefit of the doubt, that's not actually what Section 1 says. I mean, if Section 1 had been intended to apply, only in the most extreme existential emergency situation, like it could have worked that way if that is what it had said. But the way it is worded, it's at least possible to interpret Section 1 as giving, pretty loosey-goosey leeway for figuring out whether or not it's justified in any particular case.
Yeah, well, maybe Section 1 needs to be revisited in a really serious manner.
Listen, the whole charter needs to be revisited. But unfortunately, we have created now such an onerous amending formula that becomes almost politically impossible to do. And even if it wasn't, I'm afraid that the political circumstances right now is such that if you opened up the charter and the Constitution, you'd have a good size constituency on the other side trying to make things worse from our point of view.
Right. So, okay, so let's talk about the courts momentarily. So, Bruce, I know you have some concerns about the politicization of courts in Canada, the politicization of the legal enterprise and the judiciary, and you're certainly not alone in that. Do you have any faith that this case can receive a fair trial?
Oh, I would like to think so. Sure. Yes. Look, listen, we have a lot of good judges in this country, a lot of very fine jurists with terrific legal minds. And yes, we have seen signs of what I would say ideological bias. For example, just to give you one small example, at his first press conference, when he became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Wagner held a press conference. And he was asked by a reporter if he agreed that the Supreme Court of Canada was the most progressive in the world. And he agreed with the statement, and he said he was very proud of that fact. The most progressive court in the world in a progressive country, which is the way things ought to be. Now, that is an expression of an ideological preference. And that's not what neutrality is supposed to mean inside a courtroom. But on the other hand, we have good judges who are able to carry out what I believe to be the proper judicial role. We saw it, for example, a short time ago when in her bail review for the bail review of Tamara Leach, a Supreme Court justice reviewed the facts and the law in a meticulous and careful and proper way and set her out on bail because that was the right decision.
Okay, so if a judge is acting properly, tell me if I've got this right. First of all, under the English common law system and its variants, let's say, that operate in Canada, a judge is supposed to take the current circumstances of polity and individuality and social change into account, but fundamentally remain within the framework evolved as a consequence of precedent and previous law. And so every decision is supposed to be tied back to a network of previous decisions, even though there has to be some transformation, let's say, on the edges. Is that a reasonable way of looking at it?
See, well, yes, exactly so. So one way it's been put is that and we have a common law system, right? So there's going to be some evolution over time. But the way they put it is, it's supposed to be evolution and not revolution. You're not supposed to have the law being sort of handed down by the courts. The lawmaking role is that of the legislature, not the
Right, not the courts, yes.
Right.
Well, and we've seen some decay of that in Canada as legislatures have abandoned their duty and left difficult decisions to a more activist judiciary. And this is a very bad thing. Okay.
Right.
So, but you think in this case at least, and perhaps in most court proceedings in Canada, that the judiciary is sufficiently intact so that a ruling on a case like this could be trusted?
Well, you see, it's impossible to tell because you don't know, who you're going to get or what's going to happen. So the track record during COVID hasn't been all that great, because one thing that courts have demonstrated is not to every single judge, but as a pattern, is on an unwavering commitment to the government's COVID narrative, so far as to allow some judges to take judicial notice of, for example, the safety and benefit of the vaccine and the risk of the virus without any evidence. And so it's neither black or white, one way or the other.
And okay. Sam, Karl, Shaun, do you guys feel that you've been through this now for about 8 or 9 months? Do you feel that as you've observed the wheels of justice grinding slowly forward, that your sense of justice has been served? I know the outcome hasn't occurred yet, but how are you feeling about the process?
I think it did earlier on. It seems to have, this is just my opinion, of course, but it seems to have deteriorated a little bit in the last few months. But I don't know, just the attitude. I'll probably let Sam speak to this more, but like early on, the government are famous, just to get this out there, for throwing us curveballs. Right off the bat, they filed a motion out of the blue, and we wondered why they didn't want to cross-examine us, and then we found out a few days later why, is they filed a motion to have our affidavits struck. So, and I'll let Sam explain that a little bit better to you.
So these are difficult cases for obvious reasons, and I also think they're difficult cases in the socio-political climate that they happen in. But I'm confident that with the record that we've produced, with the approach that we've taken, which is a very no-nonsense, nitty-gritty, pay attention to details, be very thorough approach. I think we have quite frankly, a very good shot at winning, and I have faith that we will get a fair and impartial hearing before the federal court. And I think to a large extent, we are and we have been in this case very resilient, and you have to be. I mean, there are some cross-examination transcripts where I have probably had to spend close to an hour to get an answer, and it wears you out, right? It's the first time ever, and I'm frequently in the commercial list with big players trying to resolve multi-million-dollar litigation disputes, and I can tell you the government is way more resilient, trying to get a straight answer. Trying to get a sense of what's happening, why it happened, when it happened, and who is involved. It's a tough process, but I think like anything else, if you do your homework and you're prepared and you're willing to, take difficult steps. I mean, we have brought so many interim motions to ensure that procedurally this moved in a way that we thought was fair and appropriate. It extracts a big sacrifice from you, and it's a very resource-intensive process. But I'm very confident that the commitment we've made and the dedication we've made is going to yield a good result for us.
Okay, well, that's very heartening to hear, because your story basically is that this is very difficult and it requires painstaking effort. But if you do it properly, it's still a fair game. And thank God for that. And so maybe I could ask you guys too, if you wouldn't mind, let's go to the funding side of this. How much has this action cost? And let's look at that two ways. There's the outright costs, right? So let's say the legal costs, but then there's also the costs in terms of time and involvement, because Shaun, you and Karl must have been spending untold hours on this, I would think, on a daily basis. And so there's a huge personal cost there. So Karl, let's what's happening on the funding front? How much has this cost, and what has it cost you and Shaun personally?
Well, I mean, actions like this are always going to cost, at least hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? That's the reality of it. And if you lose and suffer adverse costs awards, then worse again. So it's going to be an expensive action. However you try and do it, the cost of the cost of the work that a lawyer has to do is going to be in there. The cost of working with expert witnesses, and as the intensity of the case builds and more motions are submitted, then of course the cost builds. Now, anybody who's had the unfortunate pleasure of suing government in the past knows that one government tactic, in the same way as many larger aggressive litigants, is to try and drown the smaller guy in costs.
Okay, well, so we have an answer to one earlier question, which is, well, why don't more people stand up? And the answer to that is, well, because it's unbelievably expensive, and it consumes your whole life. And so, first of all, that means most people literally cannot do it. They don't have the time, because they don't have the excess resources, in some sense, that allows for the time. I'm not suggesting you guys were sitting around on your laurels, but you at least had the financial acumen and resources to make something like this vaguely possible, and that would put you in a small percentage of people to begin with, and then you'd have to be willing to do it, and then you'd have to find the right lawyer, and then you'd have to be able to withstand 8 months of, and that's a lot, of trouble on the personal and the judicial and the cognitive front. So it's a very difficult undertaking. How have you funded it so far, and what's been the story on that front?
It's been a mix of two things. It's been a mix of personal funding and also some, helpful donors that have, offered to come forward. But the majority of it ultimately is, in our case, is going to be personal funding at this time. And I think the funding of these cases is a very interesting aspect in itself. And I think the structure of the organizations that do this work in Canada is something that's worth, discussing. From my perspective, I don't see that the freedoms guaranteed by the Charter should be political. But there seems to be a tendency that organizations, perhaps more to the right of centre, are left with the battle of fighting for them. And I find that curious, because the loss of freedoms affects everybody in Canada, wherever you sit in the political spectrum. So we have in Canada a small group of organizations that take on this kind of work, and they rely on lots and lots of small donors, occasionally large donors, perhaps, Justin Centre for Constitutional Freedoms, Canadian Constitutional Foundation, and some recent new entrants, such as the Democracy Fund and so on and so forth. And indeed, we're putting together a charitable foundation, which will be up and running shortly, called the Institute for Freedom and Justice, which we're hoping to fund in slightly different way, so it can take on two issues, one being key areas of litigation in relation to this kind of constitutional challenge, and equally as importantly, and I think, is supporting people who want to provide additional education to Canadians regarding the freedoms that should be protected by the Charter in the first place. And few people know about the Charter and about the content of. And in fact, I'd say one more thing, Jordan, if I can.
Yeah,
we were talking about Section 1 earlier, and Bruce and I have had one or two conversations over time about this. And I've been fishing around from the start, trying to find out where Section 1 even came from. And what I found was that it was very difficult to find anybody who knew. And I asked some people that you'd know. I mean, we asked Preston Manning, for example, and is really interested in this. And he said, that's a great question. I've no idea. I asked Brian Beckford. Brian and I have had some emails about this, and Brian doesn't really know where Section 1 comes from. It's there, but who wrote it, who drafted it, I don't know. Section 33, we know, has a connection to Peter Lougheed, but where does Section 1 come from? And I've been grubbing around trying to find out why. I've had people in the Parliamentary Library looking at this.
Suppose it was a concession to Quebec claims for sovereignty?
No, I don't think so. I think that's more. I mean, Section 33 is interesting because that was put forward, and from what I can see, connected with Peter Lougheed, and then Pierre Trudeau seemed to want a sunset clause in there, and that seemed to be the concession. But Section 33, as Sam will tell you, doesn't apply to mobility rights in the Charter. And but Section 1, the best I can think, and I can find out so far, is I think you have to look to the mid-1970s and possibly the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is binding on Canada. But if you read that carefully, Section 1 could possibly be an attempt at a sweep-up clause to catch some of the issues that arise out of that document. And at the timing, 1982, that would seem to fit that some consideration after the ICCPR came in.
Well, that's a great mystery, you know, the fact that the biggest set of possible restrictions on our most fundamental rights is based on a clause whose authorship is unclear and whose intent is unspecified. Shaun, do you have anything else to say on the funding front before we return to Rupa?
I'd like to take this opportunity to, early on, as I said, I started a GoFundMe. We closed that down when the Freedom Convoy ran into problems and when GoFundMe stuck a knife in their back, so to speak. So I shut it down and I moved it over to Give, Send, Go. But I just quickly wanted to say thank you to all of we have supporters on social media and so on that have supported us through Give, Send, Go, and I wanted to thank everybody that's donated thus far.
Is that still operating?
Yes, it is. The Give, Send, Go, it's the Canadian Freedom Litigation Fund.
So if people want to donate to your cause, it's the Canadian Freedom Litigation Fund at Give, Send, Go.
That's correct, yes. And also that'll be funding another case that I'll be running is filing an application and injunction against ArriveCan and the quarantine.
Oh yes, there's a good idea. So so everyone who's listening, some of you are going to be thinking, well, what can I do about this? And well, there is something you can do. There's 2 lawsuits pending. They're both going to be very expensive. I'm sure many of you who are watching and listening are somewhat perturbed and annoyed, let's say, about that bloody ArriveCan app, which is a complete disaster and an unnecessary addition to the passports, which we also can't get. And so, right. Rupa, one thing we might derive from this conversation, especially in relationship to Karl's last comments, was that if the press was doing its damn job, then maybe private citizens wouldn't have to be taken on the government. So now you have this story. It's a red-hot story, as far as I can tell. It's a blazing hot story, and you can't get people to publish it in Canada in the mainstream journals or newspapers. And this is even the case, despite the fact that you're actually a columnist for the National Post. And the National Post is a conservative newspaper. I have some associations with it. They'll publish my work fairly frequently, and I've had a good working relationship with them. But why are no Canadian newspapers of note? We won't even talk about the TV stations, but especially not the CBC. But why are no Canadian newspapers of note picking this up? And why in the world do you have to deal with the Englishman instead and the Telegraph, let's say? That'll be better for the story anyways, but it's still appalling. And so tell us about your experience with this.
Yeah, it's a great question, Jordan. I worked with Barry Wise and Peter Savodnik, my editor, before when I wrote a piece on the truckers' protest back in February, and it had a great impact. I think it was an important contribution at that time to dent what I felt was an incredibly corrosive narrative that had been in place at that time, which characterized the protesters as white supremacists, racists, and bigots, and so on and so forth.
You were with the truckers, weren't you? You actually went there like a journalist, sort of.
Yeah, I live in the area, and I really went out of curiosity. I just wanted to see what this was about. On the first day, that first weekend, I spent about 10 hours in the freezing cold. It was one of the coldest days of the winter at that time. And I walked everywhere, and I was pleasantly surprised. In fact, it was a very, it felt like Canada Day. And I even tweeted about it and said, it feels like Canada Day in the winter. And I was immediately criticized for it, for romanticizing what was supposed to be and would be insurrection, and I just didn't get that impression at all. I met some of the nicest people, and I spent 2 weeks or 3 weeks during the course of the protests speaking to everybody, the truckers, the protesters, anybody who wanted to chat with me. I managed to have a conversation with them. Sometimes these were long conversations. I would be up till 2, 3 in the morning speaking to people. And then I wrote this piece for Barry Wise's Substack at that time, and she reached out to me, and she'd seen my tweets, and she wanted me to do something for them. I really enjoyed their professionalism. And my piece had a great impact, and I wanted to continue that relationship with them. So for me, it was not necessarily, is it Canadian media versus someone else? I really just enjoyed the experience, the learning experience that and I just wanted to continue to learn by through working with them. Having said that, your question is a good one. Why isn't anybody in the mainstream media picking this up? Why is it that no one wants to talk about it? There hasn't even been an acknowledgement of the piece so far. I haven't even been trolled by anybody, by any of the mainstream commentators for writing this piece. There has been literally no response. It's silence. It's looking the other way. They're talking about everything else under the sun. And it's extraordinary, and I don't quite know what to make of it.
Well, I think it turns back to something we talked about earlier. I think that the bitter pill that Canadians are being asked to swallow is so large that they're choking on it. And I can understand that. You can have some sympathy for that. Some of us, Bruce and I, for example, and I know Bruce quite well, we've been observing this sort of thing developing for like 8 years, something like that, or longer than that.
Oh, longer than that.
Longer than that.
What a while, yeah.
How long? 10 years? How long?
At least a decade in concrete terms. But I think it's been in development for decades.
Yes. Well, it's sort of gone like this, right? It's been accelerating. But I think most people don't think about political issues that often, and that's because they're busy with their lives, and they also don't know what to believe or who to believe, and that's certainly being scrambled now. And so I think that's why your story, this is what stunned me so much about the continual scandalous behavior of the Liberals. I don't think that people can process it, because my sense of it, looking at it, is that every week, and that was certainly the case earlier this year, particularly, especially when the Emergencies Act was brought about. Every week, something so scandalous is produced by the federal government that under normal conditions, it would immediately produce the dissolution of a reasonable parliamentary government. And it just happens one week after another. And I don't think people can, and then the media covers it very badly, but I don't think people can believe it. Plus, of course, the CBC, for example, is 100% in the hip pocket of the Liberals, not least as a consequence of the $1.2 billion a year subsidy, which enables them to report no news to no viewers. And so I think that's this wall of ignorance that you're running into. You said it's got to be something like that, Rupa, because why at least aren't the progressives hassling you, let's say? Even that's not happening.
No, I'm just being attacked by a bunch of bots, a bunch of nameless trolls who are going around calling me a Russian agent. I've been called a seditionist. First of all, they said the documents didn't even exist and that I was making it all up. And then the federal court sends out a tweet a couple of days later saying, given the interest in this case, we're actually making these documents more easily available to the public. So that shut them up. But then they had to move to something else, that I was a Russian agent, or I'm lying about this, and
I think you've just internalized your oppression. That's my sense of the situation. So in any case, you haven't been able to promote this story in any of the normative channels. I mean, Barry Weiss's Substack is not a minor league operation. It's very influential. So that's definitely something. Yeah. But it's definitely outside the normative structure of media discourse, particularly in Canada. And I think it's quite striking that the Telegraph has at least opened up an invitation to you to continue this kind of investigative work, and that isn't happening in Canada. It's like, why are newspapers not willing to jump on a hot story?
Well, this is extraordinary, Jordan. So I was speaking to a journalist, and she told me that newsrooms are just don't have the money anymore. They just don't have the resources to put together a bunch of people. And I said, wait a second. I said, wait a second. I'm a freelance columnist. I did this entirely on my own. I read through over 1,000 pages of transcripts over a few days. I spent, I was up late into the night working through them and thinking about how I could frame this story. If I can do it, you can do it. You can so easily do it. You just need one other person maybe, to work with you. I just don't buy this excuse at all. Initially, I wanted to give them the benefit of the doubt. They've only now discovered the documents. Let them go through it, and maybe they will eventually get to it. It's now been more than a week since the story broke. It's been about 3 weeks since the documents have been out. And it's just extraordinary that no one's really touched it. I will also point this out to you, that it's even the independent media which constantly rails against the mainstream media, rightly so. Even they haven't gone to town on the story. And I can't figure out why. What exactly is going on?
Okay, well, we're all trying to figure out what's going on. That's for sure. Rupa wrote this story for everyone who's listening, just so we remember what we're doing here. Rupa wrote a story about a week ago that she published with Barry Weiss. Court documents reveal Canada's travel ban had no scientific basis. And so that's quite the headline. And so I read that and thought, well, this probably needs to be talked about. And so you referred to Bruce Pardy, who's a constitutional lawyer, and to Karl Harrison and Shaun Rickard, who've taken out a court case against the Canadian government, and their legal counsel, Sam Presvelos. And we've walked through the story. And so what are you hoping to have happen? That's another thing I'd like to know.
Yeah, no, good question. I guess the most important thing for me right now, and well, for all of us as a group, and anybody who's following along for the ride, is that this case be heard. Right now, they filed a mootness motion against us, as you know, because the travel ban has been suspended, hasn't been revoked, it's been suspended, and they've made it quite clear that they can bring it back at any time that they so choose. And the Attorney General of Canada has filed the mootness motion against us. So on September 19th, we are all heading down to Ottawa for a public hearing. Sam's actually in the process of filing all of our final submissions and everything, just to fight that battle before we even get to our end game, which is the hearing in late October. So to me, all the support has been absolutely amazing, and we hope that continues.
Okay, well, let's stop with that again. So I want you to say again exactly what the listeners and viewers can do to help you continue this battle. So they can go to Give, Send, Go. That's Give, Send, Go. And what are they looking up?
They're looking at the Canadian Freedom Litigation Fund.
Canadian Freedom Litigation Fund. Okay, So if those of you who are watching find this compelling and you'd like to do something about the fact that your rights are being abrogated by a government hell-bent on instrumental partial tyranny, then there's something you can do. You can send some money.
They can also find me on social media. My name will be on the screen here somewhere in the bottom notes. And we'll be more than happy to have people follow along and support us. And I really appreciate what you've done, Jordan, in getting this story out to as many people as...
I think it's a privilege. I look at this and I think, well, unless I'm completely out of my mind, and lots of people think I am, this is like the hottest news story that's hit Canada in 15 years, and I get to tell everybody about it. So why is that not a good deal, apart from the fact that it's utterly horrible and contemptible and appalling and pathetic and weaselly and deceitful and instrumental and traumatically unbelievable. Okay, Karl.
You're right on the money.
Oh, man, it's something, man. What a world. Karl.
Yeah, I mean, I echo Shaun's comment that when you start these actions, you want them to be heard. And this is so important in that regard. It's such an enormous matter of public interest, and it has huge ramifications and repercussions and risks if a Canadian government can get away with this kind of behaviour where it makes routine health choices, coerces people to make routine health choices in order for them to take part in normal aspects of Canadian society and to exercise the sort of freedoms that everybody would expect in a modern liberal democracy in the West. And that's hugely important to get it heard. I'm sure Sam can say something about the issues with the mootness motion, and that comes up, I think, on September 19th or 21st, as Shaun has said. And if we're successful in persuading the court that this matter isn't moot and should be heard, then there's a 5-day hearing in Ottawa, a public hearing in person in Ottawa in the federal court from October the 31st. And that's an opportunity for the media to actually finally engage with, as you say, perhaps the biggest story in Canada in a decade about how the government has behaved around this particular issue.
On what possible grounds could they find it moot?
I'll let Sam deal with the detail, but essentially, I'll say this, right? I'll say this because I found this isn't really a legal point, but it's curious, I find it odd that the Attorney General of Canada is saying to the Canadian people, please ignore my cabinet colleagues. Please ignore Mr. Alghabra, please ignore Mr. Duclos when they say to you in a formal public statement that these measures have been suspended and we've got every intention of bringing them back in the fall if we feel like it. And David Lametti, the Attorney General of Canada, is saying, please ignore these guys. They happen to be my cabinet colleagues, and one of them happens to run the Transport Ministry and one of them happens to run the Ministry of Health, but please ignore them. Take no notice because they haven't been suspended. These measures have been lifted for good, and that's why the issue is moot. And clearly it's not. That's not moot at all. And mootness in Canada, something Sam can come on to, peculiar here. Not the same in the UK, not the same in the US. This is an issue which can be repeated in the short term and is worthy of review.
Well, you'd think even if it's moot now, which it isn't, that doesn't mean that there's not something to be said about what happened. So what happened is unconscionable. All right, Sam, over to you.
Well, mootness is a funny thing, especially in the context of a pandemic. Mootness in the context of a pandemic is a very different consideration, I think, than mootness ordinarily. And I'll give you a very concrete example of that. A couple of months ago, before the Ontario Court of Appeal, I was doing a constitutional challenge on the restrictions on outdoor gathering. As you know, being outdoors is one of the safest places, probably the safest place to be with the COVID-19 pandemic. And at the time I had filed my materials for appeal, there were still restrictions outdoor. By the time the Attorney General gave me the responding materials, the restrictions were lifted. Several months later, the restrictions were back in. And a couple of weeks before the hearing, the restrictions had been repealed. The Court of Appeal dismissed it as moot. And so you're left in this very unfortunate and precarious and quite unpredictable situation of, timing. And it's, I don't agree that the issue of timing, especially in the context of a very fluid pandemic where the government has demonstrated its willingness to turn on and off various, and quite frankly, recycle through various different public health measures, timing shouldn't play a role in this. This is not moot in the sense of, a court in another area has already made a decision, has already said this is unconstitutional. This is mootness in the context of very fluid public health measures. And so regardless of whether or not those public health measures are activated, and that's what I'm going to say, because we all know they can be activated and reactivated at the whim of cabinet, right? Regardless of whether they're presently activated, the manner in which these decisions are being made and the tools that are available in the context of a public health crisis are critical.
We've established a very dangerous precedent here because God only knows what's going to happen, for example, when the next serious flu comes around. Because it's going to be indistinguishable in many ways from the mortality rate, say, of COVID by all evidence, especially if it's a serious flu, and it's likely to be because we haven't had one for a while. And so why wouldn't we go down the same road immediately? Because I think that's probably what we'll do. So, okay, Sam, anything else to say more generally about the situation? What's going to happen over the next couple of months as far as you can tell? And what are you hoping will happen?
Well, obviously I'm hoping that as Shaun and Karl alluded to, I'm hoping that we succeed in our mootness motion, which is going to be heard in September in Ottawa at the federal court. I think we have very cogent reasons why the matter deserves its day in court and to be heard and decided on the evidentiary record that we have spent, the better part of a year and significant resources investing so that the truth can come out. But more broadly, there's two statements I'd like to make to everyone who's going to be watching and listening to this segment. The first one is, our case is not political. Even though we make a lot of reference to the Liberal government, it's actually not political. And the reason why I'm saying that is because democracy should not be political. Transparency in the decision-making of the people that we have trusted to govern us, according to a basic set of immutable principles that are frankly based on, decency and liberty, that's not a political thing.
Well, it's not as if, just to point this out, it's not as if the Conservative governments at the provincial level haven't done exactly the same thing. It's not as if Aaron O'Toole didn't roll over instantly when these sorts of things came along. So if it's political, it's not partisan.
Right. Exactly.
Right. And I think you're right. And that's probably a better way to put it. It should not be a partisan issue, because today you might be on one side of the vaccine debate, and tomorrow you'll find yourself on the different side of a wholly separate debate. And you hope that as a citizen of a democratic country, the government's going to show you a basic level of respect and decency and dignity. And the second thing that I wanted to mention is, it's very important that in the times of crises like now, in a pandemic and an unprecedented pandemic in recent history, we need to remind ourselves that this should never serve as a carte blanche for the government to do whatever it wants.
Yeah.
Circumstances of uncertainty, the absence of evidence is not evidence, that anything should and can be done. And we must remain vigilant now more than ever. And we need to refer back to the principles that we know are true. And as the evidentiary record will show, the government had principles that were developed in the context of influenza pandemic. And we need to avail ourselves of those principles. We don't throw them outside the window, which, seems by a large measure was done here. I really want to thank Shaun and Karl, two people who made extraordinary sacrifices, as you've mentioned earlier. I can't imagine the toll this has had on their personal and private life. I know I speak with them more often than I speak with my fiance. So I can't imagine what that has resulted on the home front. And, it's Canadians like Shaun and like Karl who are taking their civic duty seriously. And it's because of the work that they have really undertaken in this case that millions of Canadians and hopefully people around the world are going to see what's going on here, and we'll learn and be better because of it.
Well, let's hope. That's the plan. Bruce, we'll turn to you and then we'll let Rupa wrap up, I think. So what have you got to say from the overview perspective?
Well, first, let me say my hat's off to these gents for having the stuffing to do this. It takes a lot of courage and determination, so good on you. Let's not fail to acknowledge how dangerous this story and this development is to a lot of people, to a lot of institutions. This is a threat. It's a threat both to the COVID narrative, but it's also a threat in a bigger sense, because we seem to have in this country a prevailing belief that governments are benevolent and act in our interests all the time. Now, sometimes they may make mistakes, and you might prefer one color to the other color, but essentially, there's a belief in the good faith of governments to do their best and to do the right thing. And stories like this threaten that belief.
Right.
They put into place the possibility that is not true, that instead we're being played by our own governments. And that's partly why I think the political class is so resistant to this and similar stories, because it does represent a kind of threat to the foundation of what we think we're about as a country and as a culture. In some ways, our biggest liability as a population is our disbelief, our inclination to not believe facts when they threaten the furniture in our heads. And you would know more about this than me, Jordan.
Yeah, well, it's no wonder, because the sorts of things, the principles that you're describing. So you imagine that here's a rule, is the more fundamental a principle is, the more other principles depend on it. And then each of those principles encapsulates a lot of chaos. And so when you're asked to, and chaos produces anxiety and desperation and disunity and conflict, it's real and it's deadly, psychologically and socially. And so when you're asked to revisit your faith in a fundamental presupposition, which is, accounting for human error, the government is acting in good faith, because that's what's being questioned here. Well, no, they're not. Okay, well, how many snakes have you just let out of the closet? And the question is, well, hopefully not all of them, but we don't really know. And it's a reasonable response to say, I'm not going to believe that without exceptional evidence. But the problem is that Rupa and the gentleman that we've been talking to have showed that there's every reason to believe that this happens to be the case. And so it's no wonder it's taking Canadians a long time to swallow this. It's a large and bitter pill. So, but not as large and bitter as the pill we will all be required to swallow if we don't wake up to what's happening.
Agreed.
So yeah. Okay, and so Bruce, if the government has in fact exceeded their political mandate, their moral political mandate, and if they have violated the Charter in at least this instance, and I would say many, many others, then what should that imply and what recourse is there apart from at the voting booth?
Well, the voting booth becomes very important in this. I mean, what you essentially need is a cultural change on the part of a critical mass of people who say, you know what? No, this is not okay. And we will not go along with this now and the next time this happens, which is going to be very soon. Unless you have that kind of critical mass, you're not going to see changes in the behavior of the press, of the government, maybe the courts, all our institutions. All our institutions, in spite of themselves, are influenced by popular opinion. They deny it, but that doesn't make it not true.
Well, you know, as I've been going around on my tour, one of the things I've sort of added is a suggestion to people for what it's worth. But I've talked to, I don't know how many people, 200,000 people, I guess, in the last 4 months. One of the things I've tried to suggest to people is that they pick up their civic duty a bit. It's like, look, and again, those of you who are listening and watching and thinking there's nothing I can do, it's like, yes, you can. You can join a political party. You can join the Conservatives. You could join the Liberals. You could join the NDP, although I don't know why you would, because they just look like Liberals to me, and I don't think you should join the Liberals. But in any case, you could do all of that. And that's not nothing. And you could get involved, and you could start to move the political landscape in accordance with your own needs and wants, and become more articulate doing so, and learn to play a role in the political process. And if you don't, then what's happening is going to continue to happen. Because we do have a system where sovereignty inheres in the people. And that means if the people abdicate their civic responsibility, then the delusional and terrified instrumental tyrants will have their way.
People should not underestimate the effect that they can have on their own and in small groups. I mean, that's what these three guys are doing on their own, for example. But if we had more people doing more things in the way you're describing, the change would be significant.
Yeah, so if you're listening and watching and you're not a member of a Canadian political party, then you got to ask yourself, what right do you have to your outrage? So, because you're not pulling your weight, man. And if you're not in any civic institution at all, you're not in a church, you're not in a business organization, you're not on a sports team, you're not engaged actively in the civic discussion, then it's no wonder that you're being blown by the wind every way because, well, that's this position you've left yourself in.
And so, when you join these places, don't just go along. You're there to change the course.
Yeah, well, and to learn. If you're young, you think, well, what can I do? It's like, well, first of all, you can volunteer. You can learn to serve the people who have a little bit more authority than you, and you will learn doing that. And if you're good at it, you'll rise up the ranks unbelievably quickly. Because one thing you can say, because people have abdicated their political responsibility, is that there's kind of a responsibility void there. And so if you're halfway competent and willing to put in some time and effort, the rewards can be incommensurate in relationship to the effort. So, okay, Rupa, maybe you can just walk us through what you hope to have happen next, what you think should happen.
Yeah, well, I can't really top Bruce, but I'll try my best, Jordan. Just to sum up this story, for your viewers and listeners. Basically, this government appeared to have made this policy by firing from the hip without any recourse to a to a scientific rationale. We know this rationale was probably concocted on the flight after the policy decision had been made. And it's also interesting that the Trudeau government announced this vaccine mandate in the lead up to an election, as it proved to be an important wedge issue for him to get reelected, even though they lost the popular vote in the end and they only got a minority government. Basically, what is unfortunate about all of this is that sound public policy was held hostage to politics, with the Trudeau government pushing these divisive vaccine mandates in the few areas where they had jurisdiction, which is namely the travel sector and the federal workforce. Also, I would like to point out that that it's odd. It's incredibly odd that Trudeau would promise vaccine mandates as part of an election campaign, rather than just simply implement them as a country-serving prime minister. If this was indeed about public health policy, why would you have to make it a campaign issue? It really is bizarre. And, you would ask me earlier at the beginning of the show about civil servants citing cabinet confidentiality. And I've been thinking about this. Exactly why, why should something like a public health mandate, why is it so confidential? Why is the rationale for a public health mandate? Why should it be so confidential? And this is a very puzzling question. And for me, it raises a disturbing possibility that there really was no rationale at all. And in the end, the emperor has no clothes. I think going forward, I very much agree with what Bruce was saying and what you said. Change is going to have to come in some form or the other. The truckers' protest, I think, moved the needle or the dial a little bit. And I know a lot of people came around and started asking these questions. Certainly, polls right now show that where previously 70% of those polled supported vaccine mandates, right now that number stands at 20%. So people are starting to rethink mandates. They're starting to ask these questions. They're starting to ask questions of their elected officials. They're asking, hey, you told us with vaccination we'd go back to our lives, but yet we're still facing restrictions. We're still looking at mask mandates. What is going on? I would also like to point out to the fact that the booster uptake in this country has been pretty low compared to most other places, and that shows that people are starting to have a rethink. If the boosters are not preventing transmission, what is the point in me getting it? So perhaps why should a 20-year-old get a booster? What's the point in that? Maybe it makes sense for someone
a child.
Or a child for that matter. So I think people are starting to ask questions. We may not necessarily see the kind of outrage that we would like to see, but I do think that change is certainly happening.
Well, maybe we'll get lucky and we'll see change instead of outrage, and maybe that's a more Canadian way of doing things. We're slow to wake up, but maybe when we wake up, we will move in the right direction.
Absolutely. That is my hope as well.
Yeah. All right. Well, I've been talking today to Rupa Subramanya, Bruce Pardy, Sam Presvelos, Karl Harrison, and Shaun Rickard. They're all in their own way attempting to bring some clarity to what's a very murky and dismal situation, let's say, with hopefully some light shining in the distance. And so appreciate you very much, all of you, for being willing to participate in this conversation and for all the diligent work that you've done and the sacrifices that you've made. I'm going to continue my talk with Rupa over at the Daily Wire Plus, where we go behind the scenes a bit and look at the details of her career and her life and what's put her in a position that she's able to do the sorts of things that we talked about today. Hello, everyone. I would encourage you to continue listening to my conversation with my guest on dailywireplus.com.